My name is Susan Noyes Platt. I am an art historian, an activist, and an art critic, an unusual combination. I examine the ways that artists address social issues, and I also get out in the street and protest things that I consider to be a problem. I will begin with artists in the early 20th century on the political left, then examine some of the issues in artists from my book, Art and Politics in the 1930s. That book studied the contradictory intersections of Marxism, modernism, and Americanism, usually considered completely different subjects, through the lens of various critics, artists, and leaders. Today, I will focus on a few themes addressed by specific artists. Next, I will present a selection of issues from my book, Art and Politics Now. It covers the period from 1999 to 2009, basically the Bush presidency, and I will emphasize three intersecting themes: police states racism, migration, and climate change. In each case, I will conclude with artists addressing recent events. Let's begin, though, with an historical example, the work of Francesco de Goya, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, from his set of prints Los Caprichos, created in the late 18th century in Spain. The 80 prints explored the corruption, greed, and repression that was rampant in the country. Goya worked for the Spanish court as their official portrait painter, but he also made sardonic prints like this one, some of which were not even published during his lifetime. The monsters here are represented by birds and bats and other frightening beasts, but of course they are a metaphor for the horrors of the power plays that suppressed the people of Spain. Goya is best known for his series, The Disasters of War, which boldly exposed the tortures and atrocities of war, as well as famine and death. Here we see two examples: a badly dismembered man impaled on a tree. The tree itself is split and dead, like the man himself. The second print, a blindfolded man who has been shot, has the caption, "And it can't be helped." Goya depicted in his painting The 3rd of May, 1808, an assassination that he had actually witnessed. This painting has been widely acknowledged as the first modern painting in the intensity of its composition and lighting, not to mention its subject matter. For example, Pablo Picasso, in his painting Massacre in Korea of 1951, depicts the use of chemical weapons based on the model created by Goya. A German socialist, Katie Kollwitz, depicted historical resistance to oppression. The Peasant War, seen here, was a 16th century uprising. You see Black Anna with her arms raised to encourage the oppressed peasants to rise up against the masters, the landowning elite. Katie Kollwitz lost her son in World War I and her grandson in World War II, which spurred her to create heartfelt images of the suffering of women in war, such as these two powerful black and white woodcuts. During this same period of time in Mexico, following a revolution which lasted for 10 years, from 1910 to 1920, the government invited artists to depict the new social order, which was encouraging peasants to read and write. The artists declared their goals to be both aesthetic and ideological in their first proclamation. Quote, "We proclaim that since this social moment is one of transition between a decrepit order and a new one, the creators of beauty must put forth their utmost effort to make their production of ideological value to the people." Although many artists participated in this period, I am going to talk about only two today: Diego Rivera, who incidentally was the husband of Frida Kahlo, and Tina Modotti. Diego Rivera created hundreds of murals inspired by the issues of the revolution, and here you see the rich versus the workers and peasants from the Ministry of Public Education, created in the late 1920s. We see the decadent rich in the foreground and workers, peasants, and fighters in the background. Rivera himself stands to the right in a tan hat and shirt, ambiguously to one side of the decadent scene. Tina Madadi was an avid communist and brilliant photographer. In this example, she depicts workers reading the radical El Machete newspaper, their hats creating an abstract pattern around the paper. She makes her point about the importance of literacy and suggests the collective energy of the peasant. Moving now to the political left in New York City before World War I, the Masses newspaper employed many artists to create pointed graphic images of injustice. Maurice Becker's cover depiction of lynching in Georgia from August of 1915 is one vivid example that uses perspective and scale to dramatize the event, as well as including a vigilante Georgian in the foreground who perpetrated the acts. The echo of the Christian crucifixion is bold and unsettling. The Masses was shut down in 1917 because of its opposition to World War I recruiting. In 1926, the new Masses emerged and again invited artists to address political issues. Here we see two examples by Hugo Gellert, The Miners Are Marching, and William Gropper's dramatic worker breaking his chain as the church and capitalists look on. In addition to the new Masses, many artists produced radical art on their own during the 1930s that addressed pressing social issues. They were stimulated by communist-sponsored exhibitions or even government art programs. Diego Rivera depicts an overweight capitalist. William Gropper satirizes a fat landlord grabbing rent money from a slum. Elizabeth Olds gives us Christ leading workers in protest down Wall Street as the capitalists shrink back in terror. Lucien Bloch depicts a desperate family passing a cornfield with huge pylons supporting electrical wires. They have been displaced by new industry and machinery. This work would appear at the height of the McCarthy era as a cover for Pete Seeger's album, Songs of Protest. Mitchell Cyprian, more of a surrealist, depicts an impoverished family standing in a desolate industrial landscape. Also on the theme of poverty is Bernarda Bryson's sarcastic image of a starving mother and child being queried by a social worker, "But can you prove he is hungry?" Bryson, by the way, was married to Ben Shahn, another politically engaged artist that I will be talking about shortly. On the right, Alice Neel, better known for her portraiture of the 1950s, was an ardent leftist in the 1930s. She also suggests the lack of caring of committees in her work, Investigation of Poverty. Racism is boldly depicted in Neel's painting of 1936, Nazis Murder Jews, based on a protest of a pro-Nazi march in New York City. At that time, the prescient sign carrier would not have realized how horrifyingly true his message was to be. The killing of black men appears often in the radical press, as here, black demonstrators killed by the police on the right. Very familiar to us today as a subject, unfortunately. Jacob Lawrence, on the left, in one scene from his multi-panel migration series, shows the sad and fearful aftermath of a lynching as a reason for people to leave their homes and migrate north. Sam Brown, on the right, depicts the view from above of a lynching with the focus on the ghastly suffering of the black victim, while the lynchers are far below. Another work by Jacob Lawrence provides a graphic representation of an eviction, a young family sitting on the steps of a tenement, all of their possessions in the street, as a goon beats them up. The 1930s also had its media demagogues, as seen in these examples by Hugo Gellert and Ben Shahn. Most famously, Father Coughlin stirred up the masses with the then new medium of radio. Hitler also was quick to realize its potential, perhaps like Donald Trump on Twitter. Gellert's print, we see the connection of money, religion, and preaching clearly depicted, with a crucifixion on the microphone and a bag of gold in his hand, as his eyes are blinded by light reflected on his glasses. He expounds with his right arm raised. Ben Shahn, less radical, more aesthetic, depicts Coughlin raising his fist in anger. Many artists photographed the activism in the streets of the 1930s. Here, Ben Shahn records a May Day march with workers and artists together. He is obviously in the midst of the march. The front rows of his photograph are all well-known artists. Note how well-dressed the men are, especially. Artists supported workers' causes at factories and mines, often getting arrested themselves. Lee Krasner describes getting arrested, and everyone gave out fake names of famous artists, which the police did not recognize. The artists produced a collective newspaper called Art Front. Here we see the May 1935 cover by the well-known artist Stuart Davis, as well as artists selling the paper on the streets. And I've just discovered this photograph of Bernarda Bryson, whose work you saw before, selling the paper to fat capitalists with a big smile on her face. During the 1930s, African American artists had opportunities with the support of the federal government. These artists are the staff of the Harlem Art Center, most of whom went on to become famous. The director of the center, Augustus Savage, is fifth from the right in the striped dress. Gwen Knight, who would marry Jacob Lawrence, is kneeling on the front left in an elegant coat. Note that there are white artists as well as black artists working there. There were also modernists as well as radicals. One of the best-known artists from the Harlem Art Center is Aaron Douglas, and this is Aspects of Negro Life from 1934, commissioned by the government for the library in Harlem, and can still be seen there today. This is the final panel, which shows coming to the promised land from the cotton fields. Note that Douglas uses abstract forms as well as figures in his own particular approach to the subject. He invokes music, both with the drummer in the foreground and the concentric circles behind the figures. One event that brought all the artists together in the 1930s was the censorship of Diego Rivera's mural in the newly created Rockefeller Center. The mural, here seen at the moment that work stopped in a clandestine photograph by Lucien Bloch, who was one of Rivera's assistants, placed the worker at the center of power, with decadent bourgeois on one side and revolutionaries on the other. The artists organized a protest meeting that brought together artists and writers from all sides of the political spectrum. 2 years later, in 1936, the American Artists Congress formed in affiliation with the Popular Front, based on the new initiative from Moscow that asked radicals to collaborate with liberals. One of the powerful impulses at the Congress was horror with the destruction of culture in Germany by Hitler. In this famous representation, we see many of the famous artists who participated in the Congress. Aaron Douglas, on the far right of the stage, spoke of the connection of Hitler's Germany to the oppression of the Negro, quote, "The lash and iron fist of fascism have been a constant menace and threat to the Negro ever since his so-called emancipation." We see a direct line with Black Lives Matter today from that speech. At their meeting, the artists passed resolutions to boycott the Nazi Olympic invitations to artists, to support the civil war in Spain, to ask for rental fees for artists, among many other declarations. At a second Congress in 1937, Pablo Picasso spoke via a transatlantic cable connection, sent over his famous painting, Guernica, to be displayed in a Congress exhibition to support refugees. Picasso represents the moment of terror as a civilian population is bombed from the sky, as well as a moment of hope with a light at the center. The painting remained in the US until 1975, the year of Franco's death. Let's turn now to contemporary art. Think about a few examples of artists addressing the three themes which I raised at the beginning: police states racism, migration, and climate change. The examples are drawn from my second book, Art and Politics Now, as well as events that occurred after the book was published. You already recognize, I am sure, that the sources and manifestation of oppression in the 1930s to the present are strikingly similar. So let us first look at police states and racism. We'll begin again with a small historical digression. The painting which appears on the cover of my book depicts the original World War II detention camp for Japanese Americans in Minidoka, Idaho, a camp where the artist lived as a very young child with his mother and grandmother. If you look closely, you will see the middle-class clothes of the people in the camp. Black clouds sweep through the scene like smoke obscuring the full view. In the surveillance tower, a soldier looks down on these innocent people. We are standing with the soldier in that tower. Shimamura is drawing the connection here of detention then and detention now, between Minidoka and Guantanamo, between the surveillance then and the surveillance now. Shimamura has returned to this topic many times in the last decade, most recently creating these two works underscoring the connections. In the painting on the upper right, his mother is joined by a woman covered in Islamic hijab, while on the left, a religious woman is on the inside of a camp, while Marilyn Monroe, a la Andy Warhol, stands outside the wire, obviously referring to the racism and prejudice that leads to detention. Martha Rosler addresses the police state in a different way, here combining the photographic images of Abu Ghraib detainees groveling on the floor with their hands tied with a swanky upper middle class interior and its occupant. This series of 2004 reprises a similar theme the artist developed during the Vietnam War era. In another print, she brings together the narcissism of buff women looking at their cellular phones while people lie dying and violent war is going on outside the window. A less famous artist, Selma Wallman, relentlessly documented the oppressions of police state in her last series called The Black Book of Aggressors. She created a series of chalk drawings on black paper that followed reports of means of torture at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. In the details, we can see that she carefully documents the techniques of beating with a heavy cable or waterboarding. Her work echoes the expressionism of an artist like Katie Colvitz, with its intense lines and her use of color, which is limited and very specific. At the time of her death, she was envisioning a new series based on Goya's dreadful painting, Saturn Devouring His Son. Her theme was the god of war consuming its victims around the planet. I copied the countries that she planned to include from the notes left on her desk at the time of her death, which you see here. You can see her method of working, also the scale of the sheets that she used and her way of drawing on prior art, poetry, literature, newspapers, and radio. You can even see a tiny portrait of Goya on the right side if you look closely. Another artist who documented the horrors of Abu Ghraib, the detention camp in Iraq near Baghdad, with both image and text, is Daniel Heyman. He had the opportunity to join a group of lawyers who were creating a lawsuit against the private contractors in charge of Abu Ghraib. The artist sat in on the interviews with an etching plate on which he wrote the words of the released detainee backwards so that when it was printed, they would be legible, as you see here. This piece, Disco Mosul, reads, "A room where soldiers would put religious men naked and make them dance for 12 hours. A female soldier would hit them if they stopped or looked down." Here you see the artist standing in a gallery with the words of a victim of torture that he interviewed, a woman who was later killed. He's honoring her by writing her words on the gallery floor. Coco Fusco intentionally blurs the distinctions of performance, simulation, documentary, and art. As she plays off the imagery of women in the military, she performs as the dominant female who gives the orders. In one piece called Bare Life, number 1, she recreated the subjection of people inside a prison. She asked participants to clean a street with a toothbrush. The title, Bare Life, refers to Giorgio Agamben's concept of bare life, the lives of those who barely survive as refugees, undocumented immigrants, and victims of violence. In her performance, A Room of One's Own, Women and Power in the New America, she stands as a military officer, commenting on the idea that the war on terror has given women new opportunities in the military. The opportunity to use their charms to conquer the enemy is one form of torture. Women were forced to flaunt their sexuality in order to taunt Muslims held in captivity. Fusco outlines this practice based on a field guide for female interrogators taken from actual information that she had. Imna Arroyo's installation, Ancestral Passage of 2009, refers, of course, to the slave trade. She is honoring those who drowned in the sea on the way to the so-called New World as slaves. Her print on the wall includes the bodies of hundreds of slaves, and her installation suggests that their spirit lives on in the sea. Tanis Selton addresses another aspect of racism in a police state, that of the blood quantum required to be enrolled as a tribal member today. Federal government guidelines require that a person must document 25% native blood in order to be enrolled in a tribe. Her vials of blood and oil refer to that, as well as to the oil companies who came to Alaska in 1971 and turned the tribes into competing corporations. The image on the left is that of a traditional tribal mask, which is now in the American Museum of Natural History. The artist has painted it on a piece of leather, emphasizing the agonized expression. In front of the mask and below it is a vial of blood and oil. Migration as a theme is usually discussed without reference to the forces that drive it. Art Hazelwood, in his prints, lays out the drug war and free trade as devastating forces in the global South. We see an overweight capitalist pursuing a dollar as a skeletal figure with a scythe drives him forward. In the field, we see the bodies of dead farmers. Nicholas Lampert speaks on his print of an ear of corn as a dropping bomb of the huge unemployment that has resulted from free trade agreements leading to migration. In addition to dumping our products on Mexico and elsewhere, neoliberal industries are busy taking over the subsistence land of indigenous people. Some are successfully resisting, however, fighting for their way of life, as we see in the words of Victor Chaltsui, speaking for his tribe in Guatemala. We work the land for 100% of our food, no machinery, no chemicals, no fertilizer, the strength of Mother Earth. The Beehive Collective, in their huge detailed prints, difficult to see here, I recommend that you look at their website, bring together the drug wars, the invasion of multinational companies, and the exploitation of natural resources. U.S. interference in the governments of the Global South since the 19th century has been also a huge cause of destabilization. U.S. interference in the governments of the Global South since the late 18th century has been an ongoing cause of destabilization. Let us turn now to the actual migration and the stages of it. First, the border. On these borders, maquiladoras, so-called golden factories, churn out electronic and medical products requiring small hands. Young girls work in these factories far from their village and the protection of their families. Many of them have been murdered. Celia Munoz documents some of those murders in her installation with shoes. In many cases, only the shoes of the murdered women have been found, as she suggests in the photograph on the right, a recreation of an actual event. Another print by Art Hazelwood depicts the giant security border, which is now imagined for our border. There is already a huge militarization of that space and a lot of fencing, but the plan is to add much more. Hazelwood emphasizes the contradiction of our powerful country fearing the simple peasants from Mexico. Ricardo Dominguez's Transborder tool contains a GPS on a cell phone, which he leaves at various places in the Sonora Desert to inform immigrants of the location of water, food, clothing, or assistance. Delilah Montoya has photographed the actual water and clothing in locations in the desert. Art Hazelwood, again, documents that the border wall divides all life, animals, plants, as well as people, and of course families. And finally, the work of Roger Peat addresses the border in the context of the monarch butterfly and the disruption of its traditional forests by drug cartels and mining companies, its inability to have a normal migration. Once in the US, especially since 9/11, when the Patriot Act allowed indefinite detention without a trial for migrants without papers, the escalation of detention has increased rapidly. The New York Times documented this migration with abstract circles not indicating any reasons for it. Here you see an article on the migration of children in the summer of 2014. And here you see the enormous numbers of detention centers which we now have in the United States, and the numbers of the people in detention. Government has said that we can have up to 34,000 beds in these detention centers, and the number of people detained each year is 441,000. The numbers are staggering. The detention centers are run by private corporations. Detention has become a big business, with all the lack of interest in human rights that suggests, leading to massive abuses. The food is so bad that the people in the Tacoma Detention Center and elsewhere across the country have gone on hunger strikes. Here is a poignant photograph of a sign by one detainee: "I am on hunger strike for my family, my people, for freedom, equality of all human beings." One art group has suggested a recreation of a detention center, Sinuela's Collective, Without a Trace, creating bunk beds and displaying videos, letters, and soundtracks evoking the horrible conditions within the imprisonment of the center. Cecilia Alvarez's painting, Con la Esperanza de Vida, with hope of life, is created in order, as she has said, to, quote, bring light to the parts of our society that are rendered invisible without value, in a visual vernacular that does not use violence as a symbol of power, excellence. Each person held without legal recourse has a story and a reason to flee. They come here with the hope of life, close quote. Within the centers, people are often kept in solitary, and this artist, a detainee himself, smuggled out a drawing of the conditions of solitary confinement, suggesting the violence of the conditions there. The statements that you see on the left call for respect, courtesy, better food, dental care, and in the small drawing on the bottom, the description of solitary states that the beds are not even long enough to lie down on. At the Tacoma Detention Center, there have been many protests. This one, for example, from the Day of the Dead, we had a GEO House of Horrors, GEO being the name of the private company that runs the detention center, and tombs for the various communities, children, and families who have been ripped apart by ICE. Fortunately, there are groups protesting and calling attention to the abuses, such as this Day of the Dead March, which included the coffins of GEO victims and a GEO House of Horrors, which contained the drawings I just showed you. Outside, we had tombstones dedicated to the communities, families, and children affected by ICE raids. Some groups are calling on artists to make art about detention. Detention Watch Network and Not One More are two of those groups. And here you see a call that was just sent out by the Northwest Detention Center Resistance Group. My last topic, which includes recent additions, is climate change and resistance to it. It intersects with migration as well as detention and deportation. In the Northwest, kayaktivism in the summer of 2015, which is the word used to refer to the thousands of people in kayaks that prevented the Shell's Polar Pioneer from leaving for the Arctic in order to explore for oil. The protest was successful, and when the Polar Pioneer returned, Shell announced that it was canceling its plans to drill in the Arctic. This spring there was another protest in the West. One of the speakers was the eloquent flutist, activist poet Paul Chirakatin Wagner, and he spoke of the crucial necessity to stop the fossil fuel catastrophe, step back into the circle of life, learn to honor the gifts of our Mother Earth. The linear action of the colonial world has a finite end, and if our Mother Earth reaches the tipping point, the point of no return for stable climate, the human race will reach that end, and there will be a great reciprocity, or giving back to our Mother Earth, but not of our liking. It will be the bones of our grandchildren and their children being given back to our Mother Earth due to our lack of respect for the gifts of our Mother. Paul Chirakatin Wagner was speaking at the protest against the expansion of the Cherry Point refinery on Indian land stolen by Ulysses S. Grant after the Civil War. As we protested the refinery, we smelled the acrid, toxic air being put out by this Cherry Point refinery. Many different Native groups spoke at the protest. Many of these tribal groups are also joining the Standing Rock protest in North Dakota, where hundreds of tribal groups have joined together to protest the pipeline across their land. This joins with my discussion of detention because certainly the Native American groups are the first to have been deported from their own lands when the white colonists arrived in the so-called New World. And this is a chart that shows the dramatic decrease in the lands of the Sioux since the original treaty of 1851. You see 1868, 1877, and then the small reservations. Finally, 2016, practically nothing left. And you see the site of the protests there on this map. This protest is ongoing as I speak. But of course, the election of Trump puts the future of all these protests into question. But let us speak of the micro actions that people are doing as part of this event. For example, in Seattle, we are building, with the help of Paul Wagner, small stoves to put into the shelters in Standing Rock, North Dakota, to keep them warm as they stay throughout the winter. We are also building a roof to put on the top of the shelters, and here you see the design of the roof and the construction of the roof in order to keep the protesters warm through the winter. Artists are responding to Standing Rock. Here is a work by Deborah Faye Lawrence that she created in honor of these protests, and in the center of it you see a red bullseye, which is where the protest is taking place. The blue diagonal line represents the pipeline, and you see that critical place where the pipeline is to cross the Missouri River is the point of contest today. Many Native groups have come out with creative expressions in the pipeline protest, and I'll conclude with this beautiful group of women in their ceremonial jingle dresses as they prepare to perform to save the water supply of the Sioux Indians in North Dakota, and by extension, the state of the planet for all of us. This lecture has included only a few examples from both of my books, as well as recent events that suggest that artists have the power to effectively address political issues in many media. The ban on political art during the years that modernist prejudice suggested that revolution occurs only in gestures on a canvas is over. Today, artists address issues with many strategies in media. A recent book provides examples, strategies, and tactics under the title Toolbox for Revolution. After our dreadful election, we are going to need the power of artists more than ever to expose injustice.